Chapter 1, in which I meet my future mentor, do a faceplant in eastern Montana gravel, get humiliated in a good way, and agree to do something for which I am totally unqualified. I am black. I was sitting in the small courtyard of an even smaller tea shop beside the road that runs from Challing to Kathmandu. The man addressing me was short, about 5'4", in his late 60s, and gazing at me with disquieting intensity. Yes, you are, I replied, not knowing quite how to respond. He was indeed, and still is, a very black man. His skin was several shades darker than my Nepali friend's, and he was clothed in a black sadhu's robe. Black dreadlocks piled atop his head. Even the cheap Chinese running shoes he wore were black. As a personification of that color, one could certainly do a lot worse. The other sadhu sitting with us on the low stone wall handed Kali Baba, as I would come to know him, an enormous chillum. "Siva! Eed!" he intoned, and inhaled the mixture of Siva booty and tobacco, then passed the chillum to me. Still being a newcomer to these things, I was a little intimidated by the massive clay cone, but I determined to give it my best shot, and touching the end of the chillum to my forehead, as I had seen others do, I silently repeated my own personal mantra for international travel. When in Rome. The two sadhus and I, along with my Nepali acquaintance, who had randomly invited me on this adventure, and to whom I am eternally grateful, continued down the road to Kathmandu, walking with a few other Nepalis and picking up more as we went along. By the time we reached the road where we boarded buses for the city, our group had grown to several dozen strong. The next I remember, we were standing in an extremely crowded street on the eastern edge of Kathmandu. People were packed shoulder to shoulder for several blocks behind us. A short ways ahead were two pickup trucks, one carrying the two sadhus we had met at the tea shop, as well as a public address system and a man who turned out to be an MC of sorts. In the back of the other pickup was a 30-foot tall iron trident, a giant trisul, weapon of Shiva. The MC grabbed the microphone and started up the first of what would be hours of call and response chanting. "Mahakali Gi! Jai!" the crowd shouted back as one. "Kalinath Baba Gi! Jai! Mahankal Baba Gi! Jai!" The trucks ahead of us began to inch forward, drawing the crowd slowly behind them. "Kalinath Baba Gi! Jai!" I shouted cheerfully along with the rest. We snaked our way lethargically down the narrow medieval streets and out onto the Arnico Highway. Those who chose to continue with the parade boarded buses chartered for the occasion or climbed into the backs of pickup trucks, as I did, and began the long, slow drive up the Canggu Hills to Mahankal, navel of the world. "Mahankal Baba Gi Jai!" It took us over 4 hours to travel what would normally not have taken more than one. When moving, the vehicles traveled at a snail's pace, a practice necessitated by the minimalist nature of Nepali road maintenance, but more often than not we were at a standstill, waiting for one vehicle or another in our caravan to be repaired. Finally, we arrived at our destination, the hilltop of Mahankal. In former times, Prithvi Narayan Saha, the warlord who first united the many peoples of what is now Nepal into a single state, came to this place to seek blessing and guidance from the goddess Kali as he set out on his quest for domination. Despite its notable place in Nepali history, when we arrived that day there was only a large peepal tree and a small, rather shoddy-looking shack. And now, of course, the largest trisul in the country. And so it was in a state of bemused befuddlement that I began my walk back down the hillside to the village where I was renting a room from an unpopular shopkeeper. As the evening's light quickly began to fade from the sky, I pondered, why the hell would they put that up there? I was born in a small town situated on the western edge of those expansive plains that occupy the center of the North American continent. At the age of 9 months I was given a walker, a device formed of plastic and shaped like a donut, suspended on 4 aluminum legs a few feet off the ground and having casters on the legs and a fabric seat in the donut hole so that a child sitting in it could use his feet to push himself around. Sensing immediately the great potential of this newfound mobility and evidencing an innate wanderlust, I decided to set off on my own. At the first opportunity, I took off down the alley behind our house, heading towards the setting sun and what I hoped would be a more fulfilling life elsewhere. Sadly, not 10 feet down the alley, my plans went awry, as being unfamiliar with the vagaries of wheeled transport, I steered my vehicle into a pothole and pitched forward onto my formerly cute-as-a-button face. I screamed inconsolably, all my plans and hopes come to naught, as Mother put down her camera and walked over to comfort me and pick the pebbles out of my forehead. And so it came to be that I would spend the rest of my childhood in the rural West, aka the boondocks, and only much later be able to pursue my dream of following the setting sun ever further westward toward some undreamt of wonderland, some Shangri-La paradise. It is often assumed by both traditional religionists as well as more New Age types that spirituality is somehow associated with those wooey moments we sometimes experience in life, those fleeting glimpses of a transcendent reality, those bizarre synchronicities that sometimes occur and leave us with a feeling of psychological vertigo and a lingering sense of elation. These moments are, however, to my mind, less important for one's spiritual development than more mundane experiences and our responses to them. It may not be popular to say, but having that wooey feeling is not the same thing as being spiritual. I was 17 years old when I had my first wooey experience, standing atop White River Pass in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, looking out across an immense tree-covered valley, floored by the supreme majesty of life and creation. Even as an agnostic and an extreme cynic, I recognized that moment of awe and wonder as being what people refer to as a spiritual experience. It was powerful, and I was and still am grateful for it, but an event that occurred much earlier in my life and did not, at the time, strike me as at all out of the ordinary has proved to be a much greater aid to my personal spiritual development than any experience of transcendence I have had. I was probably 9 or 10 years old, and my father and I had spent hours creating a magnum opus of a cake for our Cub Scout troop's annual father-son cake auction. Our masterpiece was a three-dimensional steam locomotive decorated in the red and black of the old Northern Pacific Railroad on one side and the green and white of Burlington Northern on the other. Our creation took home the Best in Show prize or some such thing, and as we were milling about afterwards in the church dining hall where the auction had taken place, our pastor came up to my father and I and complimented me on our cake. "That's a really nice-looking cake you guys made." "I know," was my snotty, prepubescent reply. Tom, our pastor, grinned at me. "Well, there's no humility in your family. You've got it all." And with that he burst out laughing. I was a clever enough child to know that I had been put down in some way, but not clever enough to know exactly how. It was a number of years before I finally figured out the import of Tom's gentle sarcasm, the word humility not being at the time a part of my vocabulary. But it has come back to me many times over the years, a check on my perspective and a subtle rebuke when I am getting a little too big for my britches. No humility in your family. You've got it all.